In the autumn of 1700, Europe's most powerful throne was occupied by a man who was already half dead. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler, spent his final months in such a state of horror that his own courtiers whispered he was possessed. His body was rotting, his mind unraveling, and with him, centuries of Habsburg rule were collapsing. The death of Charles II would not only end Spain's royal dynasty, but ignite a continent-wide war. Yet the real terror was not in the politics, was in watching a man slowly disintegrate, while desperate priests and physicians tortured him with brutal rituals in hopes of saving both king and empire. Charles II was not merely unlucky. He was the product of generations of inbreeding. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were cousins. His family tree had twisted in on itself for centuries, until his genetic makeup was more damaged than that of a child born to siblings. Spain had gambled its empire on keeping bloodlines pure, and the result was a king who could barely live. From birth, Charles was broken. He could not walk until 8, barely spoke, drooled constantly, and bore the grotesque Habsburg jaw that left his mouth hanging open. Seizures, fevers, and hallucinations plagued him for life. Still, at age 4, he was crowned king. For decades, his court clung to the illusion that he could rule, while Europe circled like vultures, waiting for him to die. By 1700, Charles was a living corpse. His hair fell out in clumps. His skin turned waxy and pale. He could barely swallow broth, often vomiting it back up within hours. His bowels betrayed him, soiling him during ceremonies. At night, guards heard him screaming that demons pulled at his limbs. Servants whispered that the stench of decay clung to him wherever he went. Medicine failed him. Bloodletting, purges, and herbs changed nothing, so the court turned to the supernatural. The Spanish Inquisition authorized exorcisms. Priests restrained him to his bed, chanting in Latin as holy water burned his skin. Witnesses swore he spoke in many voices, childlike screams, guttural growls, even unknown languages. Each session left him unconscious, bruised, and bleeding. Yet priests claimed his brief moments of clarity were signs of victory over demons. To the outside world, Spain had gone mad. The French ambassador wrote that the Spanish have lost their king and their minds. Protestant Europe mocked Catholic superstition, but inside the palace, nobles clung to hope that exorcism could save both body and throne. By late October, Charles was skeletal. He could no longer stand or even hold a pen without help. Factions battled at his bedside, forcing his trembling hand to sign wills that named rival heirs, each signature more illegible than the last. His queen, Maria Anna, confessed in letters that she could barely enter his chamber. The smell of death was so unbearable. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II finally died. He was 38 years old. His body was described as putrefied, without blood, without brains, and full of water. With him, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty ended and Europe plunged into the War of Spanish Succession. The story of Charles II is not just the death of a king. It is the death of a bloodline poisoned by its own ambition, a dynasty that believed it could conquer the world by keeping itself pure, only to create a ruler who became a living warning of what happens when power and pride destroy even the human body itself. Correspondence with European courts, attempting to secure her own position in the coming succession crisis. Her letters from this period reveal a woman on the verge of her own mental breakdown, torn between guilt over abandoning her dying husband and terror at the prospect of watching him die. The palace had taken on the atmosphere of a death watch. Servants moved through the corridors in whispered conversations, and the normal routines of court life had been suspended. Foreign ambassadors sent daily reports to their governments, each trying to be the first to announce the king's death and the beginning of the succession crisis that would reshape European politics. Charles's final conscious act was reportedly to receive the last rites of the Catholic Church. The ceremony was conducted in his bedchamber, with the full pomp that Spanish protocol demanded. Though witnesses noted that the king showed little awareness of what was happening around him. His responses to the priest's questions were barely audible whispers, and he lacked the strength to make the sign of the cross unassisted. The last day of Charles II's life, November 1st, 1700, began with what palace observers described as an eerie calm. The king, who had been screaming and convulsing for months, lay still in his bed, his breathing so shallow that attendants had to lean close to detect any sign of life. The violent seizures that had tormented him throughout his final weeks had suddenly ceased, replaced by an almost peaceful stillness that many interpreted as a sign that the exorcisms had finally succeeded. Father Marichalet maintained his vigil beside the royal bed, conducting whispered prayers and occasionally touching holy relics to the king's forehead. Charles's eyes remained closed, but his lips moved constantly in what the priest interpreted as silent prayers, or perhaps final conversations with the supernatural forces that had plagued him. The room was filled with burning incense and the soft sound of Latin chants from the assembled clergy. As the hours passed, members of the Spanish nobility began to gather in the antechambers outside the king's bedroom. The atmosphere was tense, with anticipation and barely concealed relief. Many had grown weary of the months of suffering they had witnessed, and some whispered that death would be a mercy for their tormented monarch. The political implications of the king's passing were never far from anyone's thoughts. Around midday, Charles briefly opened his eyes and appeared to recognize some of the faces around his bed. According to witnesses, he attempted to speak, but only managed to produce a few incomprehensible sounds before his eyes rolled back, and he lapsed into unconsciousness again. This brief moment of awareness would be his last, though his body would continue its struggle for several more hours. The actual moment of death came quietly, almost anticlimactically, after months of dramatic suffering. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, palace physicians noticed that the king's already weak breathing had stopped entirely. They waited several minutes before officially pronouncing him dead, fearful that he might suddenly revive, as he had done several times before during apparent death episodes. The immediate aftermath was carefully choreographed according to Spanish royal protocol. The king's body was left undisturbed for exactly 1 hour before being examined by the court physicians. Father Marichalet performed final prayers and declared that the demons had been successfully expelled from the royal remains. The Spanish nobility present in the palace immediately began the complex process of managing the succession crisis that they had long anticipated. News of Charles's death was supposed to be kept secret until official announcements could be prepared, but word leaked from the palace within hours. By evening, messengers were racing across Europe, carrying the news that would trigger the War of Spanish Succession. The major European powers had been preparing for this moment for years, and mobilization orders were issued almost immediately. Queen Maria Anna, who had been absent from her husband's deathbed, was formally notified of his passing by palace officials. Her reaction was reported to be one of visible relief rather than grief, though she quickly composed herself to fulfill her ceremonial duties as the deceased king's widow. Her own political future remained uncertain, as she would have no official role in the government of Charles's successor. The autopsy of Charles II, conducted on November 3, 1700 by the royal physicians, Dr. Miguel Fernandez and Dr. Antonio Genga, revealed the full extent of the genetic catastrophe that had befallen the Spanish Habsburg line. Their detailed report, preserved in the Spanish Royal Archives, provides a medical document so disturbing that many historians have struggled to convey its contents to modern audiences. Upon opening the king's chest cavity, the physicians discovered what they described as a heart the size of a child's fist, blackened and shriveled like a piece of leather left too long in the sun. The heart muscles showed extensive scarring and appeared to have been barely functional during the king's final years. Dr. Fernandez noted that it is miraculous that this organ sustained life for as long as it did, as it bears little resemblance to a healthy human heart. The king's lungs were found to be filled with fluid and showed signs of chronic infection. Large portions of the lung tissue had essentially rotted away, creating cavities that explained Charles's chronic breathing difficulties and his inability to speak clearly. The physicians estimated that he had been functioning with less than half of normal lung capacity for most of his adult life. Perhaps most shocking was the condition of Charles's brain. When the skull was opened, the physicians found what they described as a brain so small and damaged that it appeared more suitable for a child than a grown man. Large portions of brain tissue showed signs of decay, with numerous cysts and what appeared to be old hemorrhages. The report noted that the wonder is not that His Majesty suffered from fits and mental confusion, but that he possessed any rationale, thought at all. Note: the king's digestive system was found to be in a state of complete failure. His stomach was severely ulcerated and contained very little acid, explaining his inability to digest food properly. His intestines showed signs of chronic inflammation and partial blockage, accounting for his constant digestive distress. The liver was enlarged and hardened, indicating long-term toxicity that may have been caused by the numerous medications he had been given throughout his life. The skeletal examination revealed the full extent of the deformities that had plagued Charles throughout his life. His spine was severely curved, his ribs were malformed, and his jaw structure was so distorted that proper eating and speaking would have been nearly impossible. The physicians noted that His Majesty's bones appeared to be those of a man twice his age, brittle and deformed by a lifetime of suffering. And most disturbing of all was the discovery of what the physicians termed putrefaction of the internal organs while the patient yet lived. Several organs showed signs of decay that typically occur only after death, suggesting that parts of Charles's body had literally begun to rot while he was still alive. This finding helped explain the terrible smell that had emanated from his body during his final months. The autopsy report concluded with a statement that has become famous among medical historians. It is a miracle that this body sustained life for 39 years. The extent of the deformities and decay suggests that His Majesty's suffering was far greater than was apparent to outside observers. Death must have come as a blessed relief from torments that no human being should be forced to endure. The physicians' findings were initially kept secret, as they painted such a horrifying picture of royal suffering that the Spanish court feared they might damage the monarchy's reputation. However, copies of the report eventually reached other European courts, where they were used as evidence of the degeneracy of the Spanish Habsburg line and justification for the coming war over succession. The death of Charles II triggered the most significant European conflict since the 30 Years' War, as the major powers immediately began positioning themselves to claim pieces of the vast Spanish Empire. Within days of the king's death, both France and Austria were mobilizing their armies, each claiming legitimate rights to the Spanish throne through their Habsburg connections. Louis XIV of France moved quickly to support his grandson Philip of Anjou's claim to the Spanish throne, based on a will that Charles had allegedly signed in his final weeks, naming Philippe as his successor. However, the legitimacy of this will was immediately challenged by Austrian representatives, who argued that Charles had been mentally incompetent and possibly under demonic influence when he signed it. The bizarre circumstances of the king's final months had created enough doubt about his mental state to provide legal grounds for disputing any document he had signed. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I simultaneously declared his own son, Archduke Charles, to be the rightful king of Spain, citing both Habsburg blood rights and the questionable circumstances surrounding Charles II's final testament. Leopold argued that the Spanish king's obvious mental incapacity, documented by years of erratic behavior and supposed demonic possession, invalidated any succession decisions he had made. England and the Dutch Republic, already alarmed by French expansion under Louis XIV, quickly aligned themselves with the Austrian position, fearing that a union between France and Spain would create an unbeatable Catholic power bloc. The Protestant nations were particularly influenced by reports of the bizarre exorcisms performed on Charles II, which they used as propaganda to portray Catholic Europe as superstitious and unstable. The Spanish nobility found themselves divided between competing loyalties and practical considerations. Many favored the French candidate, believing that Louis XIV's military strength offered the best protection for Spanish territories. Others supported the Austrian claim, arguing that maintaining Habsburg rule was essential for Spanish identity and independence. The months of uncertainty surrounding Charles's death had left the Spanish government in chaos, unable to present a united front in the face of foreign intervention. Portuguese and Italian territories within the Spanish Empire began declaring independence or switching allegiances almost immediately. The weakness displayed during Charles II's final illness had convinced many regional leaders that Spanish central authority was collapsing, and they moved quickly to secure their own positions. The empire that had once been the most powerful in the world was fragmenting as news of the king's death spread. The economic implications were immediate and severe. Spanish colonial trade, already disrupted by months of uncertainty about the succession, came to a virtual standstill as merchants and colonial administrators waited to see which European power would ultimately control their territories. The price of Spanish government bonds collapsed on European markets, and several major banking houses faced bankruptcy due to their exposure to Spanish debt. By spring 1701, what had begun as a succession dispute had escalated into open warfare across multiple continents. The War of Spanish Succession would rage for over a decade, ultimately reshaping the balance of power in Europe and establishing Britain as the dominant naval power. The death of one genetically damaged king had triggered a global conflict that would cost millions of lives and transform the modern world. The death of Charles II marked not merely the end of her individual life, but the collapse of one of history's most powerful ruling dynasties, the Spanish Habsburgs, who had controlled vast territories across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa for over 2 centuries, had finally succumbed to the genetic consequences of their systematic inbreeding. The dynasty that had once boasted that the sun never set on their empire had produced a final heir so physically and mentally damaged that he could barely function as a human being, let alone as a monarch. Modern genetic analysis of Habsburg family records reveals the full scope of the biological disaster that led to Charles II's condition. Researchers have calculated that his genetic makeup was equivalent to that of a child born to parents who were full siblings, a level of inbreeding that virtually guaranteed severe developmental problems. The Habsburg practice of marrying close relatives, intended to preserve political alliances and concentrate power, had instead created a genetic bottleneck that made the production of healthy heirs nearly impossible. The historical significance of Charles II's death extends far beyond the immediate political consequences. His passing marked the beginning of a new era in European politics, where dynastic claims would increasingly be challenged by considerations of military power, economic interests, and national identity. The bizarre circumstances of his final months, particularly the public exorcisms, became symbols of the superstition and backwardness that Enlightenment thinkers would use to argue for more rational approaches to government and society. The medical aspects of Charles's case have continued to fascinate researchers for centuries. His autopsy report represents one of the earliest detailed medical examinations of the effects of severe inbreeding, providing valuable insights into genetic disorders that wouldn't be fully understood until the development of modern genetics. The horrific physical and mental deterioration he experienced serves as a stark reminder of the biological limits that constrain even the most powerful political institutions. The Spanish Succession War that followed Charles's death reshaped the global balance of power in ways that continue to influence international relations today. The conflict established Britain as the dominant naval power, secured French hegemony in continental Europe for a generation, and began the process of Spanish imperial decline. The war also marked the beginning of truly global conflicts with battles fought in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and other colonial territories. Perhaps most significantly, the grotesque spectacle of Charles II's final months helped accelerate the intellectual changes that would define the Enlightenment. The image of Europe's most powerful Catholic monarchy, reduced to conducting public exorcisms on a dying king, provided powerful ammunition for critics of traditional authority. Philosophers and political theorists would point to the Spanish courts, desperate superstitions as evidence that rational thought must replace religious dogma in matters of government. The legacy of Charles II also highlights the human cost of absolute power and dynastic ambition. His life, marked from birth by severe disabilities and chronic suffering, was sacrificed to maintain the fiction of Habsburg legitimacy. The courtiers who surrounded him were more concerned with extracting political advantage from his condition than with providing him with compassionate medical care. His story serves as a reminder that even kings and emperors are ultimately human beings who can suffer and die just like anyone else. The transformation of Charles II from a living person into a historical symbol began almost immediately after his death. Within decades, Enlightenment writers were using his case as an example of the degeneracy of absolute monarchy, while Catholic apologists argued that his suffering represented a form of religious martyrdom. These competing interpretations have continued to evolve, with modern historians attempting to separate the historical facts from centuries of political and religious propaganda. The terrifying final days of Charles II of Spain force us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, suffering, and the human condition that resonate across the centuries. Here was a man born into the most privileged position imaginable, heir to the world's greatest empire, surrounded by unlimited wealth and absolute authority, yet condemned to a life of constant physical agony and mental torment by the very genetic legacy that gave him his throne. The Spanish court's response to Charles's condition reveals the darkest aspects of human nature. When confronted with mortality and the loss of power, rather than providing their king with compassionate end-of-life care, his courtiers subjected him to increasingly brutal treatments and desperate attempts to extract political advantage from his suffering. The public exorcisms, conducted as much for political theater as for spiritual healing, transformed a dying man's agony into entertainment for the nobility. The medical horrors revealed in Charles's autopsy remind us that genetic diversity is not merely a biological concept, but a fundamental requirement for human flourishing. The Habsburg dynasty's systematic inbreeding, practiced for political rather than biological reasons, created a genetic catastrophe that culminated in Charles's grotesque physical and mental disabilities. His case serves as a powerful argument for the importance of genetic diversity in human populations. The political consequences of one man's death, a war that would rage for over a decade and reshape the global balance of power, demonstrate how individual human frailty can trigger massive historical changes. Charles's inability to produce an heir, directly related to his genetic disabilities, created a succession crisis that European powers had been anticipating for years. His death became the catalyst for conflicts that would determine the fate of nations and empires. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Charles II challenges our assumptions about progress and civilization. Here was one of Europe's most sophisticated courts, surrounded by art, learning, and culture. Yet, when faced with their king's illness, they resorted to medieval superstitions and brutal pseudo-medical treatments. The gap between their scientific knowledge and their actions reveals how quickly civilized societies can revert to primitive behaviors. When confronted with mortality and the collapse of their fundamental beliefs, the human element of Charles's story should not be lost amid the political and historical analysis. Whatever his titles and privileges, he was ultimately a human being who suffered tremendously throughout his short life. His final months, marked by physical agony, mental confusion, and the desperate interventions of those around him, represent a form of suffering that transcends historical periods and social positions. In an age that often seems obsessed with power and status, Charles's story reminds us that death comes to all, regardless of wealth or position. The legacy of Charles II continues to influence our understanding of genetics, politics, and human nature. His case has been studied by medical researchers investigating the effects of inbreeding, by political scientists examining the collapse of dynasties, and by historians seeking to understand the transition from medieval to modern Europe. His life and death serve as a lens through which we can examine larger questions about power, suffering, and human dignity. In the end, the terrifying final days of Charles II of Spain serve as both a historical curiosity and a timeless moral lesson. They remind us that absolute power corrupts not only those who wield it, but also those who enable it, that genetic heritage cannot be manipulated without consequences, and that human suffering deserves compassion, regardless of political circumstances. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty may have died with Charles II, but the lessons of his life and death continue to echo through history, warning us about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of human dignity in the face of mortality.